That's experiencing a handful
Hmm.
or somebody in the news or
Sure.
somebody that you might have
Sure.
interacted or family member, but
Sure.
that's not everybody
Sure.
because not everybody is going to think that same
Hmm.
way, or not every church is going to force you to believe what
Yes.
they believe.
Yes. And I would also just say that goes back to the broader conversation you mentioned at the beginning.
Hmm.
What is cultural Christianity,
Yeah, yeah.
and what is a personal religious faith pursuit of a relationship with Christ?
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rough Cut Faith. It's once again Scott and Mike here talking about various aspects of faith and life and
Yeah.
social life and
So
all
excited.
that stuff.
So
Yeah.
exciting.
We're very excited to talk about this today.
We're possibly the most excited we've been
This is my
all
excited
day.
face.
I've known that for years,
Yeah,
Michael.
I know. This is also my angry face. So I can see why it's hard to interpret.
I don't even know how to take you anymore. This is why we don't have nice things, Michael.
Yes, I
Oh,
smash it
man.
all. All right, today we're dealing with misperceptions in church or of churches.
Hmm.
And we talked about potentially making this more like a series.
Yeah, pulling this back in every now
Yeah,
and then.
yeah. So we're gonna talk about a few topics today, a few subjects that um, we think in the general culture can be misperceptions of church.
Mhm.
And if this is something that that you notice as a viewer or a listener, if there's a particular misperception or there is a perception that you have that you'd like us to address, please let us know, because this would be interesting to keep it going as a series that just pops in every once in a while. And if we have listeners who are like, "Hey, it feels like every church is this. What do you think?"
Yeah.
So why talk about it though? Why address it?
Why? Well, so sometimes if you were to consume social media or watch the news or anything like that, you sometimes get this feeling that as Christians, you're just one gigantic block of people.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to be able to break down some of those misconceptions that really, like, if somebody goes, "Oh, you're a Christian, you must be
Yep,
this,"
yep.
right? And so we wanted to be able to at least address a handful of things, that kind of come out of that we were like, I just wish maybe some folks would understand that even if that may be true about us, that's not true about everyone within Christianity, or if it's true about others, and you sit back and you feel like you're in the minority all of a sudden. Sometimes
yeah.
if you are trying to follow Jesus, you can feel very isolated when you're sitting there and you're going like, does anybody else think like this?
Yeah,
Does anybody
yeah.
else have these kinds of questions? And so the hope and why we wrote this down initially on our idea board was just to maybe give voice or a platform for somebody to go, I'm not sure if I fit into that context. I'm not sure if I fit into this, like this whole grouping of people. It's like, you're an American, so you must be this. You're you're German, you must be this, and like meats and
Bratwurst.
I was gonna say that, but I thought that would have been too stereotypical.
All the worst.
You're the worst, Michael. I was really, trying not to feed into stereotypes there.
Thanks.
But I mean, some stereotypes are there for a reason, So
it's quicker.
That's why your face is the same. It's just that German background a little bit, right? So, but being able to give voice or a platform to say, hey, I'm not really sure that I fit into that.
Yeah.
Or why do Christians in particular have this reputation? And I think it's worthwhile to say, sometimes we've earned those, generally as a whole, and yet there's always been, even throughout church history, looking at the Reformation, different things. There's always been there's like a mainstream of Christian thought, and there may be similarities in some of the bigger ideas, but there's always been these subcultures of Christianity that reject some of the mainstream positions
Mhm.
like it's more the implications, not necessarily some of the theological convictions, but some of the implications of how this gets lived out
Yeah.
and the way that they process scripture, the way that they look through it
Mhm.
for consistency. And so we just thought it would be, an interesting conversation to have,
Yeah.
to be like, hey, what's a misconception that you think people have about the church, and do you agree with it, or not?
Mhm.
Like what's a general
Yeah.
idea somebody has about the church, and if you could unravel that thought, what would it be?
Yeah. Do you-
So
so, would you say Christians or the church? Like
I
that's
will. That's a good.
maybe
That's a good
maybe that's a
distinction.
maybe that's a bigger play. That's a
Yeah.
more
Well,
big
this
umbrella place to
episode's
start.
totally different now. Thanks, Mike, for asking questions
Well,
again.
are all Christians the church, or
Okay.
are all churches the Christians?
So I would say all believers and followers of Jesus
Hmm.
as Lord and Savior are His people.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're His children. And if we were going to use modern vernacular, then I would say Christians, right?
Yeah.
But
The earliest Christians
Were-
followed
yeah,
Jesus.
they're called followers of the way.
They were known as followers of the way,
Yeah.
as in the way that Jesus taught them to
Mhm.
live.
Yeah.
Um, and I think we've mentioned before, the word church is the gathering.
Hmm.
So it could be a gathering in Greek, the ecclesia could be a
Yeah.
gathering of any
Yeah.
group.
Called out, the gathered, the
Yeah.
assembled, right? Yeah. It's
Yeah,
all.
it's so in our context, the church is the gathering around some story. A church is a gathering around some form of spirituality,
Hmm.
some followers of something,
Hmm.
and then the Christian church
Hmm.
would be the followers of Christ,
Yes.
those who would follow Christ and gather together to follow Christ.
Yeah. Thanks for clarifying
So
that.
so there's kind of like tiers
Yeah.
in that, and then you have the other big umbrella of Catholic and Protestant,
Mhm.
and those are not necessarily synonymous with followers of Christ. There's overlap. If you have
Yeah.
that Venn diagram,
Yeah.
there's Catholic and Protestant, and then the overlap would be followers of Christ.
Hmm.
They could be in both, and
Yeah.
there may not be followers of Christ in both. So
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean all the same thing.
Sure, yeah, because there are some places where Christianity is very much a part of just the cultural identity,
Yeah.
not necessarily a personal practice.
Mhm.
So, and that's true no matter what the denominational affiliation or the bigger umbrella of Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I guess I would be looking at it in that sense from somebody inside going like, why are all the Christians like this?
Yeah.
And then somebody from the outside going, why are all the Christians like that?
Mhm,
You
mhm.
know? So it would be like a generic term to refer
Yeah.
to Christianity, where it becomes almost like a straw man attack. It's like, I disagree with this.
Yeah.
And so everybody must be like that.
Right,
And I guess
right.
that's kind of the framework in my mind about like what would be some of those things. And I think you've even kind of gotten right to the first one that we had talked about, which is like, well, all Christians are the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, all men are just the same. All women
Mhm,
are just the
mhm.
same. We know we disregard that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I've seen plenty of posts online of all evangelical Christians are like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
Well, it is hard to get away from that
Mhm,
when everything, especially in the last few years, everything's filtered through a political lens.
Sure.
So you have 82% of evangelical Christians voting for Trump.
Mhm.
So it's hard to get away from the all Christians are like this politically.
Sure.
They all think this way politically. They
Sure.
all vote this way. So
Yeah.
even in that, though, I think that's a misperception
Mhm. Yeah.
because you have the people who, well, you have, what is that? 18%, not a huge amount, but 18%
Yeah.
is a large chunk of people who would call
Sure.
themselves evangelical
Yeah.
Christian.
It's almost 2 out of every 10.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, it's not the majority.
Who didn't? So there were 2 out of those 10
Yeah.
didn't vote for Donald Trump, and then you have a large majority of those who
Mhm.
voted Republican
Yeah.
because of their convictions. They didn't really care who was the candidate. They
Yeah.
were just like, we're just voting for this. So
Sure.
it's not a fair assumption to say
Sure.
all churches are MAGA churches.
The other yeah, and the other thing that I would just address is that there are mainline and evangelical churches that also vote Democratic.
Yeah.
Right. And so sometimes we forget about that.
Yeah, yeah.
That when you're like, oh well, all Christians are like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is very like now having grown up in the South, there was a big chunk of my experience was that if you were a Christian, you voted, Republican.
Yeah.
Never imagining that I would live in an area where you hang out with folks and they're like, if you're a good Christian, you vote Democratic.
Yeah,
Or there's a lot more that I
Yep.
experienced like that here when we
Mhm.
moved to this area. And
Mhm.
so I think that's like a really easy way to go. Hey,
That's another big umbrella because
Sure.
we're kind of like getting down to smaller and smaller
Sure.
umbrellas, but that's
Sure.
a big umbrella.
And we've talked about at some point we need to have this conversation in and around like the patriarchy,
Yeah.
the role of women in church leadership
Mhm,
and some of
mhm.
that, and that we felt like that was just a bigger
That's a
conversation.
much bigger one than what we want to deal with
But
today.
but
Yeah.
you still sit back and you go, like when you exist in one microcosm,
Mhm.
you would assume, yes, absolutely, that's exactly the way it is. But when you begin to like expand your interaction with people within the
Yeah,
Christian thought
yeah.
and worldview, you begin to realize that is not the case
Uh-huh.
across the board at all. And
Yeah,
in fact,
yeah.
so sitting around and walking through all of these things, uh, the more that I have read, the more that I have studied, and the more that I've tried to look at and find other voices
Mhm.
and other scholarship that's out there, the more that I've come to realize, oh, there is a much broader
Mhm.
scope of within the church. My grandmother was a Pentecostal preacher lady. I didn't know her like that. I knew her from the Salvation Army, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That was my grandmother. My dad had an experience kind of growing up outside of church.
Mhm.
He went to church with his grandparents a couple times when he was little.
Yeah.
Became Mormon, ended up leaving that tradition, eventually befriended a Baptist pastor, and became a Christian. My mom had they tried a few different churches, but
Mhm.
my mom had a real negative experience with church as a young woman, as a child, because a very conservative
Yep.
Pentecostal mother made life always.
Yeah.
I love my Grandma Fern. Don't get me wrong, but I'm sure that Grandma Fern was not the easiest person to deal with at times.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was like, so by the time that I was aware, I don't remember church really until I was a little bit older as a kid.
Mhm.
And then, then I remember like, okay, church was a thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then that was in Oregon, and then in California, and then in West Virginia, church was still a thing.
Mhm.
And so we kind of hopped from community church to Baptist church to until like where we settled into a little community where it just became this reality that all of a sudden I look back and I experienced a smorgasbord of churches,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it was a house church or
Mhm.
like you name it was across the board.
Mhm.
And then when we met, we met in a community church, and then
Yep.
and then we started a church, right?
Yeah,
And so it's like I get very I get very, I won't say frustrated, but it's just discouraging when you have friends from a variety of traditions
Mhm.
that love and are faithful to Jesus as best they know how, and
Yeah.
have a reasonable reason for
Yeah,
why they
yeah.
practice the things they do, that other people would go, oh, well, they're not, they're suspect of them
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they disagree.
Yeah, and I think that's one aspect that we'll talk about in a moment. I think the misnomer of placing all churches under the same umbrella of
Mhm.
all churches are this way. I think it doesn't allow for exploration and recognition that every church has its own culture,
Yeah.
and like you have to engage with that culture
Yeah.
in order to understand whether or not or who they are.
Sure.
Um, I think in some ways that's why denominations do exist,
Mhm.
because it's almost like a franchise.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, if you're going to go to a Baptist church somewhere,
Yeah.
if you're going to go to a Southern Baptist church, you pretty much know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
You go to an independent Baptist church, like there's a bit of a spectrum, but here to here, and you're kind of going to go here.
Yeah.
If you go to a United Methodist Church, the spectrum maybe looks a little bit bigger. It's going to go here to here.
Mhm.
But the spectrum of churches worldwide is like this big.
Yeah. Yeah.
And these being this big can also be followers of Christ.
Sure.
Like you can have various views. There's
Sure.
only a few things scripturally that we are said that are said like, hey, you got to hold on to these
Yeah.
to be an Orthodox follower of Christ.
Sure.
But within those couple of things, then that gets interpreted
Mhm.
out into a huge number of various
Sure.
and different things.
Sure. It's like they keep the denominational convictions,
Yeah.
right? As best many of them are rooted in somebody's interpretation of Scripture,
Yeah.
or where they prioritize
Mm-hmm.
certain parts of Scripture.
Yeah. Or how it's expressed in worship.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways that I explained it to my kids when they were young. They were going to school with, well, we live in an area that's 85% Catholic.
Yeah.
Whether or not they all attend that's up for debate, but it's 85%
Yeah.
of this population is Catholic. So my kids are going to school with a lot of Catholic kids and a lot of other various denominations,
Yeah.
and they come home in 4th and 5th grade and are starting to ask questions. Why
Yeah.
do we do that? What's the difference here?
Yeah.
And the way I tried to explain it was different people believe, we may believe similar things
Mm-hmm.
about the Bible and about what the Bible says, but the way we express it is going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's important to recognize that the expression of faith doesn't negate the faith.
Mm-hmm.
The expression is just how that culture expresses that faith and spirituality.
Sure.
And so it's not fair to say every church is exactly the same, because every church will express their faith a little bit differently.
Sure.
And I think
Yeah.
that's important to remember.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the Bible doesn't give a real clear, like, this is how your worship is supposed to be done.
Yeah,
Like Paul
yeah.
never really expressed or explained.
Put an order of
Yeah,
worship in
here's
as
how
one of his
here's how
letters.
every single service should be conducted.
Yeah.
It's not in Scripture.
Yep.
You can look at some of the different practices within the early church and go, okay, a lot of those things we still do. Some of them we don't, right?
Yeah.
But there is a little bit of freedom even within Paul's mind
Mm-hmm.
of the way that the church gathers. Not that the church gathers, but that
Yeah.
like what happens when you're together.
Yeah.
Like there's a few things that he talks about. There should be order. It shouldn't
Yeah.
be chaotic, right?
Mhm,
There should
mhm.
be, so it's
Should
there's-
focus
it
on
should
Christ.
focus on Christ.
Yeah.
There, remember the Lord's Supper. Like
Yeah.
there's certain things that you look at and you go like these things were a part of the early worship, right?
Mhm,
And so so getting into that, we should just be able to recognize, hey, there is a diversity of expression in worship.
Yeah.
I think where it tends to get like the negative stuff, usually it's the chaos and the dramatic that tends to grab people's attention. And so whether that's the charismatic, preacher that, collapses,
Yeah.
or the people that look like, that they're using faith like a means to their own gain.
Mm-hmm.
There's stuff that we could look at and go, does God desire our joy? Absolutely. But does that mean we just ignore the uncomfortable parts of life, ignore the suffering, ignore the humanity?
Yeah.
No, not at all. And I think sometimes it's easy to, like I remember when Preachers in Sneakers came out and sitting back and being like, oh my goodness, like that's the outfit. How much were those shoes?
You're wearing.
Yeah.
This preacher is wearing $3,000 worth of clothing.
Yeah.
Easily.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute.
What? Yeah. Is that what?
Am I in the wrong denomination?
Yeah.
Like what?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. No.
Yeah. This is where are they getting?
Yeah.
Where's this coming from?
Yeah. But I think I would make the distinction there. And again, this might be even just saying the same thing that I have said all along, but or pushed back against. There comes a point where when you're following Jesus, you're not following Jesus for your own gain.
Yeah.
And so if what ends up being highlighted is your otherness from people, like
Mhm.
look at how much God has blessed me,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Then I think it goes sideways.
yeah.
Um,
When the focus becomes financial,
yeah,
and I think that that is the misnomer there is that people believe that financial success equals God's blessing.
yeah,
And so, oh, I look how wealthy I am.
sure,
I must be doing all the right things.
hmm,
God is truly blessing me because I am wealthy,
yeah,
because I have all this money,
yeah,
and this church has all this money, and
yeah,
I got a second jet stream
hmm,
because God has blessed this church
yeah,
so much.
yeah,
Um, and that's I think that just feeds the idea or the misconception that church is all about money.
yeah,
Churches are all about what they can bring in. They're
sure,
about fleecing people, and
yeah,
I think that it's fed that misconception or misperception of church is fed by that, because those people tend to be the ones that have a following.
yeah,
They're the ones that are loud, that are boisterous,
hmm,
that get they even may be controversial, but even controversial people get a following
yeah,
because their faces are present.
yeah.
They're the people that embrace media. They embrace getting their name out there. They're
Yeah.
personality driven and
Might go
whatever.
back to that narcissistic conversation.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's when you end up in a larger population center as well.
Hmm.
Um, that tends to, a crowd draws a crowd,
Yeah, yep.
um, and it's
And there's an energy there
mhm,
that
yeah,
people are looking for.
yeah. I remember like when I was at a previous church and was doing student ministry, we would look at what's critical mass. Like,
Hmm.
at what point can you do something and have it be a positive experience? Like, what's the minimum number
Yeah,
of people you
yeah.
need to have in a room?
Hmm.
And that was a very like strategic conversation, but um, and we don't use that language, but I know that there's times where we would look at and say, hey, can we do this the way we did this?
Yeah, yeah.
If there's 15 people in the room
Yep.
as opposed to 60 or 70
Hmm.
or
Hmm.
100,
Yeah.
right? And it's one of those dynamics of that's the way it is.
Yeah.
Like that's just human groups.
Hmm.
And so I don't want to be like, oh, small church is it, like or all churches are like the big stereotypical things, but there is when you see a group getting, you know, there's more energy there.
Yeah.
There's more people there. So maybe the giving is even if it's a little bit, but there's more people that give a little bit. All of a
Hmm.
sudden, then that ministry looks like it's like
Yeah.
blowing up and
Yeah.
exploding.
Yeah.
Like it's like, oh, this is going great. This is
Hmm.
going so
Hmm.
good. Um,
And you also see the big buildings.
Yeah.
I just recently watched a video of someone. I have no idea what their church background was, but they were um, they were recording with their phone from a car
yeah,
going past a church that
Oh.
was the size of a shopping mall.
yeah,
And they're going past and just going, "Oh my goodness."
yeah,
How many people could have been fed with
Yeah.
this? How many people could have how
Yeah.
many homes could have been provided
sure,
if the funds were diverted from building this gigantic structure
yeah,
to those in need?
yeah,
And I think that that's the perception of the culture
sure,
is the churches we hear about are the Joel Osteens,
yeah,
the North Points,
yeah,
the Mars Hill when
Yeah.
it existed.
yeah,
These gigantic churches of 20,000, 50,000 people, multiple campuses, huge campuses all over the country. Um, those are the ones that make the news.
Yeah.
The Hillsongs.
Yeah.
They make the news. They're the fastest growing. They've got millions of dollars in
Yeah.
budgets. But a vast majority of the churches in the country are small,
yeah,
70-person
Yeah.
churches. That's the average attendance.
yeah.
And the mean attendance is like 82.
Yeah, and I would even throw this out as a misconception because I had to wrestle with this.
Mhm.
That just because a church is big doesn't mean that it's a bad church.
Right.
There are plenty of examples of those large churches that are leveraging things in the community,
Yep.
are working
Yep.
with other churches. Like we've got some
Yeah.
friends in Buffalo that like I've seen firsthand the way that they have just this is a very large church, but they just continually like pour into other churches in the community,
Yeah,
trying to
yeah.
build relationships, investing in other,
And serving their
yeah,
community in
and-
various
and
ways.
so it's like,
Yeah.
wow, that's cool, but sometimes if you go, well, that's a big building, that's a big church, they
Yep.
must have automatically
You just
missed
immediately
it,
go
right?
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but again, that comes to the point where we have to say, listen, not everybody is the same.
Yeah.
Like you
Yep.
may sit here and go, I have no desire to be in a mammoth
Yep.
church of thousands and thousands. But that doesn't just mean that it's automatically a wrong thing. You know, you should get to understand how is it organized? What's
Yeah.
the culture of it? What is are the people in leadership, are they all about them or are they about Christ and about
Yep.
mission and
Yep.
empowering people and encouraging people? They're like every church has its challenges, but you're
Yeah.
right. The majority of churches are small,
Yeah.
which might be why, sometimes some of those misconceptions is just, well, they must be simple backwoods,
Yeah.
uneducated, whatever. That's not
That's
the case
also
either.
not a-
That's
that's a
also a
misperception.
misconception,
Yeah.
right? And so I guess it's that sense of we all have misconceptions.
Yeah.
I have misconceptions about people, and so you continue to engage, you
Yeah.
continue to learn to interact so that you
Yeah.
push back against that.
And that goes back to the first part, like, is every church the same? No,
No.
they're not. And that's one of the beautiful things about the church is they're not going to all be the same.
Yeah.
Just because you're familiar with one guy that you see online that yells a lot doesn't mean that the church down the street also has a guy like that online that yells a lot. It doesn't mean that the big church is squandering funds.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the small church
Isn't.
is being wise with their
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
And the big church may need those facilities because they've got 30,000 people coming to it.
Yeah.
But they're also diverting those funds. They're diverting the income to help the community.
Yeah.
And without that big church of 30,000 people, the community would be worse off.
Yeah.
So it's not fair to just make a broad judgment call.
Yeah.
All churches are talking about money. All pastors are greedy. Everybody wants this, and just to keep it to themselves and are insular.
Yeah.
But I think that you will find churches that talk about money because churches function on donations. That's it. Like they're not selling.
Sure.
You're not selling wares. You're not out there
Most aren't.
investing.
Some are, but not.
But for the most part, you have a nonprofit organization whose entire livelihood, whose entire presence in the community is dependent on people giving money to that organization.
Yeah.
So it makes sense. Now, we try not to talk about money a whole lot here. It's not, even if we do talk about it, it's always in the context of living generously rather than giving money.
Yeah.
And
Unless
that's
a passage talks about it specifically.
Which very few are like, hey, give money to.
Yeah.
You can't find a lot of
Give money to
passages that
us,
say
right?
give
Yeah.
money to this church. It might be easier if there were, but there aren't, so we don't talk about it.
Well, I mean, we could make it sound like that.
Which is the problem.
Which is the problem, right? Yeah.
That is the problem.
Yeah.
But it's not uncommon for churches to talk about financial elements of life. But if there's a church that constantly talks about it, then you're like, okay, there's a red flag.
Yeah. If it's talked about in a way that's like, you give here and then God will unlock blessings.
Yeah.
in your
Well,
life.
that's ridiculous.
That's
leave.
groundless.
Just
Go.
leave.
Yeah.
But it's unfair and it's not healthy. To assume that all churches, because some churches that get a lot more media attention, they speak for all churches.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thought as you were describing that. I'm like thinking about the congregation of people that worship here, and I'm like, there's a ton of diversity of thought here.
Yeah.
Theologically, socially, economically, like there's a massive diversity of people here.
Yeah.
And so to say, oh, everybody is the same.
Yeah.
Like, no. And for the churches that think that they're all the same, they're not. I almost guarantee. People are just afraid to say what they think.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of why, why it seems like a big group thing sometimes.
I think that's the other misconception or misperception is that all Christians or all churches think the same and do the same thing. We touched on that with the political aspect.
Yeah.
but they all believe the same thing.
Yeah.
So it does become like this hive mind kind
Yeah.
of thing.
Yeah.
Now, like you said earlier, stereotypes are there for a reason.
Yep.
There are churches, there are denominations that do that.
Yeah.
So you can't discount the fact that it does exist.
Mm-hmm.
But to immediately write it off as, well, everybody
Yeah.
thinks the same.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, and you've already mentioned it, for me, we've been at the Grove now for 13, going on 14
Yeah.
years.
Somewhere in there.
Something like that.
We're too old to remember
Yeah,
specifics.
after we celebrated
13.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We celebrated 10 years, and after that, I was just
Yeah.
like, there's too much going on. I can't keep track anymore.
Yeah. 13 with like 2 years of prep.
Yeah, yeah.
2.5.
So, in a large way, this has been insular.
Yeah.
Because all of life as pastors, everything that we do is focused on the people of this church.
Yeah.
We have coffee with them. We have lunches with them. We sit down and counsel them. We're friends with people here.
Mm-hmm.
So a diversity of thought and opinion is not new. Like, I
Yeah.
just assume
Yeah.
that that's just the world that we kind of live in.
Sure.
I could have breakfast with somebody who's a staunch political conservative and have lunch with somebody who's a far progressive,
Mm-hmm.
and they both worship here on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
And they're friends.
Yeah.
They'll talk to each other. They'll
Yeah.
enjoy that conversation together.
Yeah.
And I'll enjoy both of those times with them.
Yeah.
But it's just they're together, and
Yeah.
we're focused on Christ, and that's the thing that we do.
Mm-hmm.
So to engage with people in other contexts
Yeah.
is always shocking to me. It's like a culture shock.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh wait, you guys
Yeah.
all think the same. Like, that's
Yeah.
weird to me.
I think that's one of the things on one of the news feeds that I was looking at. There's an author that has left Christianity and is generally pretty critical towards it.
Mm-hmm.
And the last couple of weeks has been very vocal about some frustrations.
Yeah.
And it's very much here is the blanket statements
Mm-hmm.
about all Christians. And I there's a part of me that's like really sad about
Mhm,
that,
mhm.
that it's just that, well, this is who you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, the very thing that many times people rail against and say, I don't want this.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't want somebody to say these things about me.
Yeah.
They will say the same thing
yep,
about
yep.
about churches and
Yeah.
Christians. And so I just feel like, you know, we can do better.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be more aware of the diversity even within,
Yeah.
you know, our tradition of following the teachings of Jesus. And it's, boy, I tell you what, it has been such a the more, I guess I will say, the more thought and faith leaders that I have read within the Christian tradition, the more I appreciate, who
Mhm.
Christ is and what He has
Mm.
done.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been times where, like, and I've kind of grown up, and I grew up in one kind of like unknown theological framework.
Mm-hmm.
Went to schools that were another theological
Yeah,
framework,
yeah.
very strong. Pulled to another theological framework by my own study, and
Uh-huh.
then have kind of found this other path
Yeah.
that doesn't quite fit nicely in either of those, but it makes sense
Mm-hmm.
within my hermeneutical approach to reading scripture
Yeah,
and seeing
yeah.
how it is assembled and looking at all those things. And for a long time feeling like, wow, I am like an outlier. And then you find several authors and
Yeah.
you're like, wait, I'm
Other
not alone.
outliers.
I'm not an
Yeah.
outlier.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is like a tradition. It just doesn't fit within the places I have experienced.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to go, okay, that has been such a, like, this process of understanding and loving and caring for people in each of those different groups
Mhm,
has forced me to not attack a straw man,
yeah. Yeah.
and to say, listen, I just disagree with you.
Mhm.
And at times that may mean that like where we choose to worship may
Mhm.
not be the same place because of our convictions.
Yeah.
But our compassion and care for each other is going to be still there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's been kind of cool over the years to see and interact with people that, you know, that when they show up, I'm like, I don't expect you to be here very long, in the back of
Yeah.
my mind,
Yeah.
just because I go, theologically, I know the tradition you're coming from.
Mm.
And for some of them, they have stayed. And
Yeah.
for some, they have come to a point where they've transitioned out. But I think of one instance where I had a conversation with someone that they said, you know, I'm different now
Mm.
after my time here because I know you guys. And even though I disagree with your interpretation of scripture,
Mm-hmm.
I love you and I know you love us. And you're some of the best pastors we've ever had.
Mm.
But I can't compromise my conviction.
Right.
Right. And so
Yeah.
to be able to sit there and for that person to go, but I will speak highly of you guys.
Mm.
Like
That's really
cool.
Yeah, that's really cool, and that's meaningful for them to be able to
Mhm.
say,
Yeah.
I'm different now.
Yeah.
Like, and I think it's a beautiful thing to be able to say, my convictions are this.
Yes.
Um,
I don't have to destroy you.
yeah, thank you for pastoring me,
Yeah.
even though my convictions are different than yours, and we're going to move on.
Sure.
We can still love each
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
with different convictions.
Yeah.
And I think that should be the way church is.
Yeah.
That should be the way that we engage with one
Mhm.
another. To recognize that the church, like there's 3 churches on this block
Yeah.
because different people have different convictions.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean there's only one right church.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the church in the middle is the right one and then these other 2 are just off the deep end. They're a mess. They're
We're
terrible.
the Southern church in this neighborhood.
Yeah, right. It's like if we could just recognize that there is a diversity of opinion within the
Sure.
church, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the stereotype of the stereotype of the Christian hive mind
Sure.
comes from the inappropriate formation of a hive mind.
Yeah.
Of churches that say, "Oh, you disagree? You're wrong.
Yeah.
You have to think this way. You have to be this way. You have to agree with us on this stance and this
Mhm.
social issue or this political issue or whatever.
Yeah.
If you don't, you're not a Christian."
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
first of all not up for us to say,
Sure.
but it's just patently false
Sure.
to say that if you disagree with me on a social issue, then you're not following Jesus.
Yeah, I think there's, some of the experience that I've had, over the last 25 years is having friendships and caring about people that have very strict lines of separation
Yeah.
within Christianity,
Yep.
and seeing those relationships, like the ebb and the flow of those over the years.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Where it's the degrees of separation. Okay, like I would say we have a pretty broad, like we don't really have a lot of degrees of separation.
Yeah.
For us with others that would, say we follow Christ,
Which would immediately cause others to separate
would,
from
which
us
would,
because
yeah,
we don't have
we
enough
don't
separation.
separate,
Yeah.
right? And so, and just watching that dynamic. Again, I think we've talked about this. I feel like pastoring in one specific context has caused us to really, in many ways, be very, very narrowly focused in what's right in front of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we don't have a lot of relationships where we're engaged in what's going on with other churches. We're not a part of a denomination, so we don't have like denominational meetings that we're going to. We don't. We have a handful of churches that we try to connect with on a quarterly basis.
Yeah.
Like, and that's a very small group that you and I would sit back and go, let's go.
Be part of that.
Let's go. Yeah. Let's keep those relationships open because there is benefit there.
Yeah.
Or at least there's commonality, and that I think that's a good thing. But the more that we have been here, it is surprising sometimes when you engage with those hard walls.
Yeah.
Of you're not like us.
Yeah.
And but I think we just have to be really careful about how we look at others within the broader scope of Christianity.
Yeah.
And that includes internationally.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
often whether we intended it or not. I remember when we went to Burma, and when I was in Thailand, often and people that I know that have gone to Africa, it's almost like you're the older, like people look at us like the older sibling that's
Yeah.
coming to give
The
like
wisdom. Yeah,
right? And I
yeah.
remember just being like having a conversation with someone and going, "Oh man, I really, I'm not. I'm
Yeah, I'm
like,
here learning just like you.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm more encouraged by your faithfulness
Mm-hmm.
than me coming over from a place of comfort
Yeah.
and saying, "Here, let me tell you about, where
Mm-hmm.
I was at the time," and
Mm-hmm.
really regretting that now, you know. But I mean,
Yeah.
it's the sense of going like, man, I'd really like. We don't look at the broader church and just go, "Oh, well, they're second class
Yeah.
Christians,"
Yeah.
at a global scale, or even within our area, our region. I think we can have respectful conversations and debates,
Mm-hmm.
with the diversity within the church,
Yeah.
but we should be very careful that we don't just at a blanket level go, all Christians are exactly like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether you're on the outside of the church looking in and going
Mm-hmm.
like, man, I can't stand Christians for
Yeah.
their social perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
I can't stand the hatred that comes out of
Yeah.
evangelicalism. Well, that's not real. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a straw man. That's a
Yeah.
blanket statement that has no.
That's experiencing a handful
Mhm.
or somebody in the news or
Sure.
somebody that you might have
Sure.
interacted or family member, but
Sure.
that's not everybody
Sure.
because not everybody is going to think that same
Mhm.
way, or not every church is going to force you to believe what
Yes.
they believe.
Yes, and I would also just say that goes back to the broader conversation you mentioned at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
What is cultural Christianity,
Yeah. Yeah.
and what is a personal religious faith
Mm-hmm.
pursuit of a
Mm-hmm.
relationship with Christ,
Yeah.
with God? What does that look like? Because I have a very hard time with, well, I grew up with it in the South of, oh, I'm Baptist. That's a church. That's where
Yep.
my parents went to church. When was the last time you were there? I don't know, 20, 30 years ago.
Yep.
You know?
I had the same experience when I visited Texas.
Yeah.
And had a conversation
Yeah.
with somebody there.
And it happens here, and you referenced it with your kids in the Catholic population.
Yep.
Of, oh, I'm
Yep.
Catholic. Really? Okay. Do you like? Well,
I
occasionally.
haven't been there since
Yeah.
confirmation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there is a, but there, so somebody may exist with a conscious framework of, oh, I'm Christian,
Yeah.
without the pursuit of
Following Jesus.
the following
part.
Christ part,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so I think we have to make a delineation and a distinction there. And church attendance alone doesn't mean it's
Right.
right.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean that you're pursuing a relationship with Jesus. It means that you have a habit of going to church.
Yeah.
And
Two different things.
two different things,
very
right?
different things, yeah.
So people have a lot of habits,
Mhm.
but so we have to be very careful to look at this process and just, in humility, go, okay, what's going on? And I
Yeah.
don't want to just make a blanket statement about a demographic of people,
Yeah.
because by its very nature, broad demographics are just that. They're umbrellas. They try
Yeah.
to gather everything into it so that you can make a generalized statement. I think we should
Yeah.
treat people individually.
Yeah. I would like to. I know this is not necessarily the case, but I would like to think that churches have a broader, more diverse field of opinion
Hmm.
than maybe the general culture
Hmm.
and the bipartisan or the partisan political structures that we see where all Democrats think this way, all Republicans think this way, and that's like a groupthink type of thing.
Sure.
And we've experienced that that's not the case.
Yeah.
That is just that's a stereotype. That's, if you look at a bell curve, there's like, a majority might fit in here.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to treat either side as if I'm not going to other any side, because that loses sight of the individual.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we hope for in churches,
Sure.
that whether you're in a church or outside of a church looking in,
Yeah.
that you give the benefit of, I was going to say the benefit of the doubt, but that's not the right way to say it. That you give the respect
Let's treat people
to
with
an
dignity.
individual, the
Yeah.
dignity to treat people as individuals.
Sure.
And overall, the whole reason to talk about misperceptions is to encourage people to give church and Christianity a look that offers something that they're looking for, and I just see a fractured culture, and I see the church as one of the institutions in a fractured culture that can draw people together for the good of each other. That's
and the good of communities,
right, the good of your neighbor. You know, so when the whole purpose of talking about misperceptions of churches is not to convince people that churches are really cool. It's to it's to say, hey, you can find a community, a faith community, that pursues spirituality in a diverse way with a diverse group of people, and that's what it's supposed to look like. It's supposed to have an element of diversity there, of thought and culture, and that was the New Testament church, the early church. One of the marks of it was various people. They weren't all this hive mind. They were, and that created issues. That's why
that's why a lot of the letters exist in the first place.
Most of the New Testament is here's how to deal with the issues that a diverse population creates. But we live in a pluralistic society. Probably more pluralistic than the New Testament church did. Because they had all the different cities and different followers of the gods, but they were all Roman cities and they were all Roman gods, and
they were in one area without rapid internet access.
Right. So there was a diversity within the early church, and it was in that diversity that the writers of the New Testament spoke into it and said, here's how you exist in this diversity. And that should be us too. To say, look, here's how we exist in a pluralistic society. Here's how we exist in a fractured political climate. We come together around Jesus, and we listen to what he said, and then we go do it. And it doesn't really matter what your politics are at that point.
I think that's why I love and hope that we be a people who focus in the Gospels. Right. Because when you're really rooted there, the rest of the Bible makes sense. The story, the connection, the threads, the encouragement of Paul to the churches, the reprimanding of Paul to the churches. When you have saturated yourself in the person and the teachings of Jesus, the rest of the New Testament, I believe, really does come alive as a response to that person and teachings of Christ. And outside of that, it becomes a manual that's devoid of the meaning in the first place. Or it's like, I don't know. I just think the longer I've been alive, the longer I've been trying to figure this thing out, the more that I spend time focusing on Christ, the more I go, that's it. And that allows for a little bit more diversity. It allows for a little bit more unity in and around Christ. And our stories, our experiences, the things that have shaped who we are as individuals, as men and women and young adults and older, saints and believers, and people outside of the church. Like, our stories are our stories. They're as diverse as there are people. And yet in Christ, there is the potential for unity among diversity. And that's where I think we've just entered into that and recognize that. And if I was, we've said, hopefully people would look at this, look at Christianity and go, I shouldn't treat that group or demographic the way that I would like the way that I would hope people wouldn't treat me because
Yep.
I fit into
Yeah,
some
something.
category,
Yeah.
male, female,
Yeah.
middle class, upper class, lower class, like,
Mhm. Mhm.
like I don't want stereotypes spoken about me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Mhm.
This, right? And I could see the counterpoint of, well, it's a stereotype because you guys do this.
Yeah.
Well, okay, not again,
Mhm.
not everyone.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
so you may not like this, but do you understand why?
Mhm.
Like what's the reasoning behind something that may be a little more true than not?
Mhm.
But that doesn't mean it's across the board,
Yep.
and that you can still find people that love Jesus that probably are would be less offensive to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. If we can, the more we follow Christ, the more we listen to Him, the
Mhm.
more we understand who He was, and who
Mhm.
He is, who
Yeah.
He's called us to be, the less we hold on to these other things,
Mhm. Yeah.
these other definitions, the other identities that we carry with us that puts us in an acceptable block that
Mm.
we're looking for that acceptance. We're
Yeah.
looking so we can adopt this identity, so we're accepted in this group, so
Yeah.
we become part of this group.
Yeah.
And then that just separates us from all the other groups. If we can look at Christ in a way that allows those other identities to drop off,
Mhm.
that opens us up to so many more people,
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
not being part of specific groups, but just being part of who Christ is
Yeah.
and His body.
That's good
I
stuff.
think that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I think that's
Yeah.
a good
Probably
place
a good place to land for the
to
day.
wrap it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thanks again for joining us in
was
this
fantastic.
conversation. Yeah.
It was a great day to be here.
The best day, maybe.
It was possibly the best, most fantastic day that I have had all day.
Wow.
Yeah.
So far this week.
After
it's the best
my
day.
time with Mike, the rest of the day is just going downhill.
Well, yeah, we all know that.
It's-
So anyway, thank you for being here. If you have questions or comments, please leave them in the YouTube
yeah.
channel, at the YouTube channel, or you can find us at discoverthegrove.com. Fill out a contact form there.
Yeah.
Let us know if there are misperceptions that you think that we should deal with, or if there are perceptions that you would say, hey, is this a misperception?
Yeah.
It seems like everybody's this way.
Yeah.
Is it true? Give me examples where it's not.
Yeah.
We'd love to interact with you in that way on here.
Yep.
So with that being said,
Yeah.
hope you have a great day.